Welcome to the Writer's Dream. On this show, we have authors who are ready to talk to you about writing their books, publishing their books, and marketing their books. We are on YouTube. We have interviewed over 100 authors now, and there are lots of good tidbits about how to write and how to publish and how to market, the philosophy of writing, the art of writing. So please tune into our YouTube channel, and also we have a Facebook page. If you have any questions that you would like to ask the authors or myself, or if you would like to be on the show, please do so through our Facebook page, which is simply called The Writer's Dream. Today's guest is Nanci LaGarenne, and Nanci is one of our encore authors. She's been here before because she's published her second book. Her first book was Cheap Fish, and her second is Refuge. Nanci is a Long Island resident, so we have a lot in common here, and welcome, Nanci.
Thank you, Linda.
So tell us about your books. Tell us about writing your books. How'd you get started?
Well, I've always liked to write. Even as a young child, I was writing poems and sending notes in the house to my parents, asking for permission to do things. I was a little bit dramatic, so instead of just asking, could I sleep at so-and-so's house or do this or have a party or something, I would write a note or a letter, and then I would say, circle yes or no. Please circle yes, because yes is the right decision, and it was always sort of...
Were you ever a teacher?
I was a teaching assistant. I wanted to be a teacher. I have two younger sisters, so I had a blackboard in the basement, and we would play school.
All right.
I was a little bossy. I'm a Leo, so I was the teacher. Well, I was the oldest, and my sisters were the students. And occasionally we wrapped towels on our heads because we had nuns in school. Not that I ever wanted to be a nun, but
I know.
Yeah. So, and then it was poetry. There was all these poems with angst, about broken hearts, and yeah. And I guess I have a serious nature, although I've been told I'm very funny. But I saw a lot of sadness and around and inequality and things like that, women that maybe weren't treated right. And so that kind of stuck with me. I was a very observant child, and so I wanted to write, I guess, about that when I got older, and but I wasn't quite sure where that road was going to take me. And then I started writing stories for magazines, entering contests. They weren't published. I was encouraged. My mother-in-law was very encouraging, told me that I was a good writer. I love to write letters. I was a great letter writer. I still write letters.
Me too.
Yeah. And I think people like to receive them. I always like to...
The whole thing, the stationery,
yes,
getting something in the mail, handwriting.
Yes.
Love all that.
And stationery was big. Once upon a time, people would go, everyone had a box of stationery. Mm-hmm. And I just loved to write. There was never a one-page letter. It was always, if you're getting a letter from me, it's in a fat envelope because I'm writing 6 pages. Because once I start writing, to me, it's easier to write than even to talk. So I can say what I really need to say, and I can say it from the heart. So yeah, letter writing. And then in school, English was my favorite class. I had English teachers. I didn't have all nuns through high school, although I did go to 12 years of Catholic school and survived. But my English, I had some great
Which
English
Catholic
teachers.
school?
I went to Mary Queen of Heaven in Brooklyn, where I grew up. And then St. Brendan's was my high school, which just had my 40th reunion, which was very interesting. And yeah, so English, yeah, I loved the writing. I loved, even in grade school, we had, I think it was on Fridays, we had these, I forget the name of them, but there was a box, and we could go and choose stories in the afternoon. And that was my favorite part of the day. I struggled through math. That was just foreign to me. I could never understand it. But writing, yeah, give me an English class or a book to read, and I loved it.
I love to listen to these stories because it took me so long to get to that point. I loved math, I loved science. I loved all those concrete things. And writing was not really my forte, and it took me well into my teaching career to discover that I could actually write. And I think for me, it was more that I had a story. I had to have a story to write about. And that's That's when I started to write, when I felt like I had a story. But you were just, and I've had many writers on say the same thing, that this was like an innate gift that they had, and they were able to, do it just most of their lives. Now, did you ever have any success with publishing with a magazine?
I didn't. I sent a story into Redbook, but later on, something happened. It was a contest, actually, by Redbook, but this was years later. I'd been married by then, and for a long time. And it was a contest that I entered, my husband entered. He actually won the contest, and there was a book written about us that we co-authored by Caroline Upshur, who was from England, and she wrote the book called Within a Whisper, which was supposed to be a romance novel based on a true story, which they ended up turning into a true story with some little things that they made up, which were mostly details, like adding fireplaces to houses that didn't have them and things like that. But for the most part, it's a true story, which was a little bit surprising at one point when they did that, and to read about your life in print when they sent the pages. A lot of it had to be edited because, it's, my parents were alive. At one point they said, is your dad alive? And I said, yeah, he's very, very much alive. I said, well, he might not like this part. So, but he turned out to be one of our, biggest supporters. And though he might have disagreed with the way things, went down, as they say, when I grew up, he was okay with it. And he actually writes himself. He writes lyrics and poetry, though you wouldn't think it because he's a real tough guy.
I met him, I think.
Yeah, retired cop in the city, and but he has this other side of him, so that could very well be where the writing gene, if you will. And I had a grandfather, my mother's dad, who kept a journal, and we found it years later after he passed on. And he wrote this great journal about everyday life and what the price of things was, and what was going on in the world, and then sensitive things about my grandmother and their relationship. So there's writers in the family, and my two sons write. My older son writes screenplays, and he's always written through high school. He's very talented, and my other son has written as well, and they're great readers. So, and I grew up with parents, though they didn't go to college, there were always books around and newspapers, and so to me, that was a natural thing.
Your family should form a company, and you should start producing plays with all this writing.
Yeah. I mentioned it to my father. We just saw him last weekend, but he's, it's not, I won't say that it's not easy. No, it isn't easy to put a book together, but I've talked to a lot of people, and I've taken writing workshops, though that's not my favorite thing to do. I'm sort of a solitary writer. I don't like writing groups. It's not a snobbish thing on my part.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm just a private person, and I'm a private writer, and it doesn't mean I don't want criticism, because I'd be very happy to have a mentor, and but that just doesn't work for me. I need to. But I found out that a lot of people talk about writing. A lot of people want to write something, even their own story or fiction, but not even just to sit down and take the time to do it. You have to be willing to sort of, even if the book isn't about you, because you're writing fiction, let's say, there's some part of you in the book. So there has to be a sort of surrendering of, you have to be taking that risk to put yourself there on the page. And though it isn't you, it's a risky thing. And I think that people are afraid to do that. You've got to edit yourself.
I think people are just, I think they're afraid it won't be good enough. And there's a lot of writing that goes on that's perfectly good enough. It's just that this is a very difficult field. Publishing a book and getting the book out to the public and having them read it is I think, one of the hardest things you will ever do, because there's just so much competition. I taught a course in how to self-publish, and I always started my little talk in a library or in a bookstore, and I would say, look around you. How many books are in this bookstore or in this library? And of course, it's thousands. And I would say, how many of each one of these books do you think gets sold every day? It kind of puts it in perspective. So your motivation for writing pretty much has to be, more than getting a bestseller. It has to be that process of getting your story out in a form that you can share with people. And I think a lot of fear of writing is fear of criticism, fear of not being accepted, and that's the hurdle that you have to get over.
I agree. It's daunting when you walk into a bookstore and you see all these great writers, or great writers that you read through the years and think, can I ever be that good, or I can't be that good, but I think in the meantime, if you're a writer, you write anyway. Nothing stops you from writing or reading. I've had children. People said I don't read. I haven't read a book because I have small children. I couldn't not read. At some point the children go to bed. There's always a book. I just can't imagine that, and I can't imagine not writing. I wrote when I had small children, even when they were babies. I wrote letters. I wrote, if there was something going on politically and I felt strongly about it, I'd write a letter to a senator or a congressman. And so I can't imagine not having a book to read or something to write about. That's just innate, I guess, in me.
I also can't imagine that there are any writers out there that are not prodigious readers. I can't imagine, separating the two, that, oh, yes, I'm a writer, but I never read anything.
No, there isn't any such thing, and a lot of people say that and they don't read. I've had people say, oh, love to support you, but I really don't read, and that to me is like,
what?
I don't get it. It's not a judgment. I just don't understand that.
I don't either.
To me, it's one of the greatest pleasures. You can go anywhere. You may not leave your house. You may not leave your state or your town, but you can travel all over the world in a book.
Yes.
And it's such a beautiful thing. It's also, if you read nonfiction or fiction, you can come across some passage in a book and say, wow, somebody really gets me. Somebody really understands how I feel. And I've had that in books at different times in my life, whether it's reading, I loved Gail Shee passages when I read it when I was 20, and then I read it when I was 40 and 50, and because you change, and obviously her book changed, but it was one of those books where, wow, that's how I feel, and somebody understands that. And even in a fiction book, a character.
So tell me about your books. Tell me about your...
I did work at the retreat. The book is not about my experience working at the retreat. So the retreat is a local domestic violence shelter.
Give us an outline of the story.
Okay, the book is about a woman therapist who mostly sees women that are, as I call them in the story, broken. So they've had bad experiences in relationships, and they have been abused. So she sees them in her private practice, and then she volunteers at a shelter that's opened. It takes place in Brooklyn Heights, and she's had something happen to her in her own life, and I don't want to give away the story, but she finds herself at a point where she doesn't know what to do, and she's sort of given up when she comes across this dilapidated brownstone and she decides to buy it in a time when you could buy one of these brownstones and refurbish them. So in the refurbishing of this brownstone, she's actually refurbishing herself and her life. She takes in boarders who are former clients of the shelter, which, as long as they're not in the shelter anymore, it's okay for them. At least it's okay in my story, and maybe it would be in real life, I'm not sure. Once they're not clients of the shelter anymore, they would move on and housing would be found, which is always a problem, to find housing. And you can only stay in the shelter for a certain amount of time. That can be extended, but again, at some point you have to leave. Right. So she takes in 4 women. So there's these 5 women, all including herself, living at the brownstone. And they have all been in abusive relationships. Some of the stories don't come out at the beginning. They're not all former clients of the shelter where she volunteers, so she doesn't know all of their stories, only 2 of them. And the women come to find a new life for themselves, leaving behind very horrific relationships. And one in particular came to me. It's not based on any truth. The characters are not people that I knew or know, but they are based on stories that I have heard through the years.
Sure.
And one character just came to me. It was just something that I had left the retreat. I wasn't working there anymore. And it was a little girl, and she had gone through, she had grown up with sexual abuse. And so it was a strong character that was speaking to me. Also, at some point, it was suggested to me to write a nonfiction book about surviving abuse in childhood, about domestic abuse. I knew people, and I just thought that for me it would be easier to write the book as fiction, but yet address that. And particularly, I mean, the book is dedicated, and it's okay to say because she wanted me to write a nonfiction book, but I dedicated it to my sister and my middle sister, and I have two. And it was important for both of us, actually, to validate what happened to us as small children, and to say that no matter that you were not heard as a child and no one defended you, that you can be validated as an adult. And through the story, I told her that, and she read it, and it wasn't easy to read, but I think it was easier that it was a fiction and the names were not changed. And it wasn't exactly our story, but we did have an experience of being interfered with, as they say, as children, and it wasn't anyone, it wasn't, a stranger, and it wasn't someone in our immediate family, but it was something that was important to write about. And it was something that I think a lot of people go through, and I think a lot of women have, if it didn't happen to them, they know people that it happened to. And if it wasn't childhood abuse, it's more common. And
people think.
Years ago, everything was swept under the rug. People didn't have the tools to deal with it. And so it was important to me to include that in the book. And it gave her a gift of knowing that not only, was I there and I know what happened, but that I, believe in her, and we have had our say, no matter that the book is fiction or not. And hopefully somebody else can feel that way as well.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Now, you worked at the shelter.
Yes.
And someone at the shelter wants you to write nonfiction, right? Do you see this book as an avenue where you could write something in nonfiction